Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this training on domestic violence in Serene Harbor, a certified domestic violence center in Brevard County. Please know that there are two handouts available for you to download. One is the PDF of today's PowerPoint presentation, and the other is a brochure on Serene Harbor. And I'm delighted to say that we have Georgia Gordon with Serene Harbor presenting today on this training for us. Welcome, Georgia.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me and for attending. This is something I'm really passionate about and that Serene Harbor is really passionate about, so I appreciate your guys' time and attention this afternoon. I want to start with a disclaimer about the mask situation. My office is inside our 24/7 shelter. So since it's communal living, we're really careful about wearing masks 24/7, especially since I'm child case manager. So all the littles are in my office all day long. So I'm extra careful. So if you ever can't hear me, feel free to put it in the chat or just let us know and I will yell louder. But yeah. I'm Georgia Gordon. I am the child case manager and prevention specialist with Serene Harbor. We are a certified domestic violence shelter, one of two in Brevard County. My role specifically is working with the kids as their case manager. I'll get into some of the different services we provide, but some of that is counseling, advocacy, safety planning. I am a master's level student in clinical mental health counseling. Currently right now working with the kids. The other side of my job is prevention specialist, which we'll get into when we get into community prevention at the end. So our agenda today, you guys can see, I want to talk about the dynamics of domestic violence a little bit, identifying some resources that you all can use and that the community can use, some abuser tactics and accountability systems that we have here in Florida, DV child advocacy and case management, what that looks like specifically for Serene Harbor and specific child needs, the impact of DV on child survivors, teen dating violence and the impact on teens, because obviously that's very different oftentimes than the impact on children. And then we'll end with some community prevention and some time for questions. So I want to start a little bit with the dynamics of domestic violence. So domestic violence defined is the trauma that doesn't always prevent itself as a bruise or black eye. The reason that I'm using this definition is because we typically tend to look at domestic violence as physical abuse and physical abuse only. Oftentimes domestic violence does include physical abuse, but it does not always. And sometimes that is not the main form of abuse, and that doesn't make that form of abuse any less valid for that domestic violence survivor. So it's something really important to highlight for ourselves and also when we're talking to others. Because not only do we want to be able to recognize domestic violence when it's just verbal or emotional or other things, we also want those survivors to be able to identify it as well. When it comes to domestic violence, there's a lot of justification of actions. For example, many survivors that we work with will come in and say, well, at least he didn't hit me, or at least that only happened once. And they're not taking into account the emotional, the verbal, all of the other things that are at play. So it's something really, really important. And if there's one thing that you take away from this training, it would be that. Survivors do not always feel like they're in immediate physical danger of the abuser. Oftentimes they feel controlled or uncomfortable. They're asked or forced to do things that they don't want to. There's a lot of intimidation, and it can honestly affect anyone. Race, age, gender, culture, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, your social circle, where you are, what you do. It honestly does not matter. Domestic violence is one of those things that transcends all of that. And so that's something that's also really important to keep in mind, because it is very easy for us to buy into stereotypes or to look at statistics and assume things. And it's super important just to realize that it transcends all of that. Anybody that we know or that is in our circles could be and most likely is a survivor of domestic violence based on recent statistics. So here's a more working definition of domestic violence: a pattern of coercive and controlling behaviors designed to exert power and control over a person in an intimate relationship. And then same, you can see the intimate partner violence as well. Domestic violence will often be referred to as DV. Intimate partner violence will often be referred to as IPV. So when you see those acronyms places, this is what that is referring to. Intimate partner violence includes the dynamics of establishing power, control, or coercion perpetrated by one or more intimate partners. So when it comes to domestic violence and intimate partner violence, I know we mentioned the physical aspect. I wanted to mention some of the other tactics that oftentimes abusers can use, because it's not just physical abuse. There is emotional and or verbal abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, digital abuse, and financial abuse. Those are typically the main groups that we use. When it comes to emotional or verbal, we tend to focus on verbal attacks or name calling, and some things that we might not immediately connect are stalking, threatening to harm not only the survivor but others, the children, the pets, a neighbor, threatening to commit suicide, heavy manipulation, gaslighting. We'll kind of go into some more definitions as we go on, but that's for the emotional. For sexual abuse, obviously sexual assault and rape, non-consensual sexual acts are all in that, but so are taking pictures and videos either without consent and or without the person even knowing, restricting birth control, hiding birth control, switching out pills for Tic Tacs or other things so that the person's not on birth control and they think they are, removing birth control, forcing sex with other people or in public. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that we might not immediately identify. So there's just some things for us to be aware of. When it comes to physical abuse, luckily in Florida, actually choking and strangulation has now been moved to a felony charge. And a lot of that is due to domestic violence advocates and attorneys and people that are in the domestic violence world fought for that very, very hard. And we as a center are really grateful for that fight, because actually when you're choking somebody and they are restricting your air, they actually lose blood cells every single second that they are losing air, and it has long-term psychological and physical effects. So we are very grateful for that. It's something that we really advertise, because we actually have an injunction for protection attorney on site that is full-time, whose services are completely paid for, who represents domestic violence survivors and their children in our area. So just a resource for you guys to be aware of for that referral. When it comes to financial abuse, there are things like limiting money, being put on a very, very strict budget, stealing money, locking somebody's bank account, gaslighting, so stealing money and then saying, well, you must have lost it, not allowing the survivor to receive a job. These are all things that we encounter every day. When it comes to digital abuse, that's something I definitely want to highlight, especially because since COVID-19 has hit, digital abuse has skyrocketed. It is one of the most used tactics in both domestic violence and teen dating violence. And that can include posting pictures or videos without consent, accessing somebody's accounts without consent, tagging people in hurtful posts, repeated calls and texts, tracking somebody's location. And I actually wanted to bring up a case study that I had with you guys. It actually was something that not our center handled, but one of our sister centers in Tampa actually handled. And they presented it as a case study, and I thought it would give you guys a good image of digital abuse. There was actually a case where a female survivor had taken all of the proper precautions. She had contacted law enforcement. She had an injunction for protection or protection order, and she had no contact with him. There was a no contact order on his side, had done everything right. And what ended up happening digitally was the abuser, who was male in this case, actually ended up creating Instagram profiles and making the Instagram account names things like, I miss you _ please come back. and he was requesting to follow her private account since he was blocked from his account. So he actually created over 18 account names and communicated with her repeatedly, requesting to follow. And it was impossible to prove who it was. Unfortunately, even though she knew it was him, law enforcement thought it was him. So different situations like that. So that just kind of shows you a real life example of how our world right now with the digital and social media power is very, very active in the domestic violence community. So now I'll talk a little bit about being trauma informed. These are different ways that you all, that us as a center, that our community as a whole could be helping survivors and their children. So being trauma informed essentially means recognizing all the different types of trauma that that survivor and or their child has going on right then. Everyone's response to trauma and stress is different. And when you're trauma informed, it's really important to understand that. Since we are a certified shelter, everybody at our shelter who is a certified advocate actually has to go through 30 full hours of training before they are ever certified or able to work with our survivors or in our shelter building. And a lot of that has to do with learning how to be trauma informed, learning that there's not just one issue that these ladies, men, or children are coming in with. Something that ties in really, really tightly with being trauma informed is understanding intersectionality. And that's essentially understanding that if somebody has one problem, it could be being exacerbated by a whole list of other problems. So when they come in for domestic violence or child abuse or stress management or whatever they're reaching out for, it's important to understand that possibly their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, their socioeconomic status, their childhood, past abuse, trauma, their personality, their mental health status, their physical health status, all sorts of things, I could go on, are tied to that domestic violence or whatever presenting problem they're coming in with. So it's just important to realize that when you're talking to somebody, not only could they be facing racism and sexism and homophobia and a whole list of other things on top of their domestic abuse situation. So it's just important to take all of that into account. This slide especially mentions the pandemic because we have had a lot of trauma responses that have been tied to the pandemic or have been worsened by the pandemic. Domestic violence has actually risen during COVID-19, and that's actually a national stat, but also in the state of Florida, it has risen. And that's kind of fairly obvious just in seeing that we've been home a lot more, especially during the times when we had stay-at-home orders and things like that. People were literally locked in their house with their abuser, or children were locked in their house with their abuser. So luckily, now that things are opening back up a little bit, one of those positives is we are able to see, more help and people getting out more and being able to recognize those signs. But due to COVID-19, one of the things we've realized being trauma informed is a health concern, hence us wearing masks all the time, everybody taking their temperatures in the shelter every day. We have a lot of different precautions that we take specifically for COVID-19, not only to protect the staff's physical health and all of our program participants' physical health, but even just their mental and emotional well-being. They have so much going on, and we don't want them to be stressed or worried or afraid that we're not doing everything in our power to prevent COVID-19 from affecting any of us at all. Their ability to manage or share feelings may have changed since isolating for protection against the virus. A lot of this can be seen in domestic violence. Unfortunately, isolation is used a lot as an abuse tactic. And since COVID-19 forced a lot of us to isolate, there could be some justification there, meaning they really felt like they needed to get out and they needed to report, but then they were trapped in their house for 6 months. And through that time, they kind of decided, I think I can deal with it. I think it's okay. I got through that. I can keep going. It's something that we've seen a lot. So kind of unteaching that attitude, being able to empower them. We believe in an empowerment model here at Serene Harbor. So we empower the survivor to pursue their own story. But COVID-19 is definitely something that we all need to be aware of, and especially with children, because the children are less likely to understand the isolation and what's going on, or the extra precautions like masks and things that we have inside the house. So taking the time to really slow down and explain to them what's going on, meeting them where they are, really helps them also feel that we're trauma informed. So active listening, I'm sure this is something that all of you have heard before, but something just to reiterate, it's very, very important when working with domestic violence survivors and their children. Domestic violence survivors are very, very keen to body language. Many times their abusers, one of the tactics is simply their tone and their body language. They don't have to be screaming, they don't have to be swearing, they don't have to be hitting you. They could just give you that look and you know. And that is something they are extremely, extremely sensitive to. So that's also part of our training that our staff does every time an advocate comes in or a new hire comes on board, to be trained in active listening, which ties so much into body language. It's very important to not be judgmental, not to disregard what they bring up or what they're going through. Just really try to focus on empathy. Really quick, I just want to differentiate. Sympathy is really feeling sorry or bad for someone, whereas empathy is putting yourself in their shoes and feeling what they're feeling. So it's really important to focus on empathy here. Paraphrasing is something that we use a lot. It really just can help the survivor, and especially the kids, feel that they're being heard, feel that they're being understood, and it even can help you understand, because sometimes you'll paraphrase or reflect something and they'll be like, well, no, that's not really what I meant, and it kind of helps you flesh it out. So especially working with the kids, it's important to meet them where they are, verbally, cognitively, physically. Since I'm the child case manager in my office, I actually have a couple different areas for kids to sit with, like the little baby chairs. And I made sure I got little baby chairs that could also hold adult weight. So when I'm working with kids, I'm sitting on their level with them. Little things like that can really help when it comes to active listening. Making eye contact. This is something that we use a lot when we're safety planning. You'll see in our services, we talk a lot about safety planning. Every single participant that comes in has a case manager. I'm the child case manager, but we also have an adult case manager. Every single participant and their children gets an individualized safety plan. So I meet with the kids one-on-one, and we actually have 2 different safety plans we do with the kids, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But safety plan is really important, and eye contact and body language is huge in making sure that we're able to make the safety plan what it really needs to be. It's very collaborative. With the empowerment model, we believe that they're the expert on their story and that we are the expert on domestic violence and safety planning. So we want to hear from them what they need, and then we will go out of our way to make sure that what they need is accomplished, because they are a top priority, children, women, men, whoever we are working with. So next I'm going to go into some different abuser tactics and then some abuser accountability that we have in our state. So here's some of those examples and definitions that I mentioned earlier. So grooming happens a lot with both the survivor and their children. An example, I will do everything to have your kids or get your kids taken away from you. Everyone believes me. The neighbors heard us fighting. They know that you scream too. Law enforcement won't listen to you. A lot of times this can tie into immigration. And the important thing to think about when you're hearing all these examples is oftentimes if there are children in the home, they're overhearing all of this, or they're seeing all of this, or they're being forced to sit down and watch all of this. So this is all being taken in by them. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is simply defined essentially as making somebody question their reality. So suggesting that survivor didn't get mental health treatment because she was caring for her children, and then calling her crazy or saying that you just have problems. The money thing I mentioned earlier. Gaslighting is very, very prevalent in domestic violence, and it really affects the kids because they're not able to form their own sense of reality, because they have the abuser saying one thing, the surviving parent saying another thing, and they're kind of caught in the middle. Abusers will do things for an action to see the survivor's response. These actions will be small in the beginning and seem caring, changing the survivor from being dominant to submissive. So this is essentially seen as manipulation in the cycle of abuse. The abuser will first be very, very sweet, very caring, very charismatic, and over time that will change and tactics will start to come. And oftentimes that comes after the children are born. Isolation over time, we already discussed isolation pretty in depth, but abusers will damage survivors' relationship, therefore making it difficult to have any natural emotion or safe haven, which can not only affect them, but also affect the relationship and connections that they're able to form with their children. Children are allowed to interact with the abuser's family, but not the survivor's family. So if the abuser were the dad in the situation and the survivor with the mom, we're allowed to go see, dad's side of the family. We're allowed to go see grandma on dad's side, but not on mom's side. And that can not only affect, obviously, the survivor emotionally, but the children as well. And we see that as two typical formats. Of course, every child reacts differently, but typically it falls under two categories. One would be the sad category, essentially, where they want to go see grandma, they want to go see grandpa, they miss them, why can't we go see them, things like that. Or it can go to the anger side and the mirroring side, where they actually begin to pick up on the abuser's behaviors and mirror that. So, no, I don't want to go see grandma. Dad said that grandma's a bad word, and dad said that grandpa's mean, so I don't want to go see them anyway. Things like that. So there are a lot of different reactions. They typically fall under those two umbrellas, which not only is going to add stress and trauma to the survivor, but that's also impacting the children and their overall development. Abuser seeks help willingly before court, and in court makes the survivor seem as the one with the issue and unfit. It's so important that we have an attorney on site because of so many tactics that tie into the court, especially with children, with child welfare. It's very, very sad and disheartening to see the different tactics and how children can be used as a pawn, essentially, in domestic violence. But it happens all the time around us. And that's why I am so grateful for this space and for you all who are listening. And taking the time to educate yourself, and it's so important that we're able to go into the community and educate others as well. So this is talking about the abusers and harm doers. The takeaway from this slide is really that not all abusers are men. That is a stereotype that comes with domestic violence. Although the majority of abusers statistically are men and the majority of survivors are women, that's not always the case. We actually work with men and women. Our shelter is women and children only at this time, but all of our outreach services, we work with men and women alike. And we do see quite a few. And a lot of times the statistics are actually skewed because men are less likely to report. There's a lot of stigma around it. So it's just important to remember that a survivor can be anybody, and also an abuser can be anybody. Female abusers need to be held accountable just as much as male abusers. And that goes back into there are a lot of female abusers who actually are physical abusers to their male survivors. However, sometimes what a female abuser, the tactic they use, it might differ from the typical image that we have of an abuser. So that gaslighting, the emotional abuse, the verbal abuse, the manipulation, things like that are still abuse tactics. And we work with quite a few men, especially our adult case manager, with counseling and with all of our different services, which I'll get into a little bit later. But it is very, very important. And then we also want to mention the age, race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation. Again, an abuser can be anybody, and we full-heartedly believe that they need to be held accountable regardless of any of those groups that they might fall into. So that being said, when it goes into the accountability of domestic violence abusers, we really like to focus on the rehabilitation and not punishment. That is how our legal system works when it comes to domestic violence abusers and the programs that we offer for accountability. Batterers intervention, for example, is a rehabilitation program. Anger management and couples counseling does not focus on changing behavior. So we'll go to the next slide and I'll show you guys a little bit more of what that means. So here you can see the layout of a batterer intervention program, or BIP, and an anger management class. Now, if I asked all of you, if we were all together in a room, do you think that domestic violence abusers should go to anger management classes? A lot of us would probably say yes, because they have anger issues. And while that is a tendency that we all have, it's important to understand why anger management is not where they need to go. And I'll give you a real world example to kind of clarify that. So anger management is based on a loss of control. That's what anger management is addressing, when you just cannot control your anger. Here at Serene Harbor and at domestic violence centers all over the country, we are very, very aware that it is in their control. Violence is 100% preventable, and domestic violence abusers are completely in control of their actions. To say that they are just losing control and they need to go to anger management because they cannot control their anger takes away all accountability. And so it's something that we really want to avoid, and that our legal system often does avoid, because batterer intervention program is court ordered. So when there is a domestic violence case, typically they will be court ordered to batterer intervention program as opposed to an anger management class. Anger management not only is addressing a loss of control, but it's also addressing that one behavior. It's going to teach them how to control their anger. It doesn't address all of those other tactics that we discussed before. Whereas you can see on the screen, the BIP program has different requirements that you have to meet. It addresses patterns of purposeful controlling and terrorizing behaviors. And that is really the highlight of what domestic violence is. And a lot of times we will get calls from family or friends or just from people in the public about, what is the difference? What makes domestic violence domestic violence? What's the difference between me getting in a fight with my partner and calling them a mean name or having a really bad argument and being abusive? And that sentence right there is the difference. When you are calling them that name or you're having that argument, to exert power and control over that person in a consistent pattern. So the power and control, those three words, are what differentiates domestic violence from any other form of violence or just a random argument. The primary purpose of BIP is to increase not only victim safety, but the child safety as well, if children are present in the home. So there is a lot of screening that goes into this, and there actually are batterer intervention programs that run in prison systems, and there are even domestic violence survivors who actually go in to prisons and speak, as well as advocates like them from our center and other centers in the country that are able to actually meet them where they are. But this essentially is built just to increase safety. The goal is to hopefully teach them what their behavior is doing, teach them healthy emotional management, and teach them really what will happen if they continue this harmful pattern. Obviously, the people that run this are all mandated reporters, etc., just as everybody in the center is a mandated reporter of child abuse, elder abuse, things like that. But that is essentially the primary difference, and this is our biggest accountability in the state of Florida. And actually recently, it has been being looked at by the state government for actually strengthening the program, adding more programs around the state, adding more accountability, adding more supervision for the people running the program to ensure that it is having the outcomes that it's intended to. So it's very, very important. Oftentimes when it is court ordered, the abusers actually can't even pay taxes before they do this. So it is really important. It's something that, again, our center and centers like us are very, very grateful for. Okay, so I'm going to start the child advocacy and case management now that we have a nice little overview and a nice little understanding of what domestic violence truly is. So I wanted to start with some statistics of children of domestic violence. 1 out of every 15 children are exposed to IPV each year. That is a very large number. And you'll see a lot of these actually are very, very impactful numbers. 90% of children who are exposed to IPV are direct witnesses of the violence. So this direct witness not only counts as seeing dad hit mom or seeing mom hit mom, it actually also is Overhearing, being in the next room and overhearing the violence. Oftentimes we see that older children become the protective figure and often usher their younger siblings into a room or into a closet. Things like that. Those all count as being a direct witness, even if they're not visually seeing it, hearing it, being secondhand witnesses. All of that is exposing them to intimate partner violence. 1 out of every 3 children exposed to IPV are child abuse victims themselves. This is huge. So that's essentially 1/3 of all the kids that are coming through our shelter that are using our outreach shelters are child abuse victims or survivors. And that's very, very important to understand, because the tie between domestic violence and domestic abuse and child abuse is so, so strong. And again, it's only gotten stronger since COVID-19. Those numbers are rising. Child abuse numbers are rising because they are stuck at home. They're doing school at home. There are a lot of students still doing that at home that we work with. So that's very, very, very important. 43% of female intimate partner survivors have children living in the home at the time of the abuse. So that doesn't even count the children who are technically not living in the home, but mom has the abuser sleeping over, or mom has the abuser picking them up from school. Things like that. It happens all the time. So how are children involved in domestic violence? Direct witnesses is something that we just talked about, with them seeing it, with them hearing it. Secondary witnesses is something that's very important to highlight. Sometimes we consider the direct witnesses as the only form of how children are being involved, and it's something that is very assumed to be the only type of way that children are involved. Secondary witnesses is essentially either the survivor or the abuser recanting whatever happened to the child, which happens most of the time, unfortunately, with the children that we work with, and really all child survivors of domestic violence. Sometimes that's if mom was the survivor, it can be, mommy told me that daddy hit her, or mommy told me that daddy's a really bad guy, or that he's really dangerous, things like that. But it could also be when the child comes in and says, well, daddy says that mommy just never listens, and that's why she's always getting all of us in trouble. And, you know, dad said if mom would just listen some more, we would all be happier, and things like that. And those secondary witness accounts can and often are just as impactful as those direct witness accounts. It's something that as a child counselor, I come across a lot, and I know our adult counselor comes across it just as much. And oftentimes that can be something that we can use in our parenting trainings that we do offer to discuss. We really try to separate the adult issues from the child issues, because in domestic violence, those lines get very blurred. With the control, with the power, those lines often become non-existent between the survivor, the abuser, and the children. So it's something that we have to reinitiate and really point out that that line does need to be there, that they are children or they are teenagers and they don't need to be involved in X, Y, or Z. So means of control. This is one of the ways that I mentioned last slide, that we talked about how they can be used as pawns. This is kind of what I mean by that term that we use in the domestic violence advocacy community. Custody is a huge one that we kind of mentioned in the examples. Well, I'm just going to take the kids, you'll never get custody. And sometimes that's threats, and then sometimes that actually is going to court and saying she's psychotic and she ran after me with a knife and I should get the kids. And unfortunately, sometimes that works. And so custody is a huge way that children are involved in domestic violence. Bodily harm, sometimes this is threats, sometimes it's real. Sometimes in domestic violence, child abuse is a huge tactic. If you don't do this, I'm going to go beat the kids, or if you don't do this, I'm going to go lock them outside, or things like that. Sometimes it does just stay as threats, but even as a threat, when the child's overhearing that, that is so impactful for them and very detrimental to their mental and emotional well-being. And sometimes it does escalate to physical altercations where it is reportable child abuse in that case. And if that's something that our staff either speculates overhears, sees signs of. We are mandated reporters, so that will immediately get reported to DCF. Kidnapping, this actually does happen. We actually have had abusers take kids across state lines, disappear in the middle of the night, take them away. In custody agreements, if it is 50-50 or if they do allow visits, the abuser will take the child and refuse to give them back. And it kind of sounds simple to us. We'll just call 911 or involve law enforcement. But when they're threatening to harm your child or worse, it can be really, really frightening. So we have had situations where they don't contact law enforcement because, say, if you call the cops, you'll never see him or her again. And it can get really, really intense. So that's something to be aware of as a means of control, that we might not often connect with domestic violence, which of course is also child abuse. Mental and emotional harm, that can not only be from the direct and secondary witnesses, but it can also be verbal, emotional, digital abuse, all of those things to the children as well. And that's something that we see often. It's unfortunate that, for some of us, being told, you remind me of your mom, or you remind me of your dad, can be a happy thing. For some of us, not so much. When in domestic violence, for the mental and emotional piece, we actually often see parents. So if the survivor was the mother, we would see the abuser, the father, go, "You're just like your mother. You're just like your mother." And to them, that is the most hurtful thing you could say, because they are trained to think that that is the lowest of the low. And it can even ignite fear, because they see what you're doing to mom and they think, if I'm like mom, that's what you're going to do to me. So there's a lot. That's just one example of a tactic that an abuser can use, but there is a lot of mental and emotional harm that is impacting children daily from domestic violence, whether the abuse is ever actually directed towards them or not. Developmental harm, this is another one that we don't often connect, but there are things like not letting the kids go to school. That's a tactic that abusers will use to manipulate their partners. Not letting them go to church or clubs or groups or after school activities. Sometimes this is to control the partner as a form of punishment. For example, if you don't do what I'm asking you to do, I'm not letting the kids go to school all week. And so that's something, as the surviving parent, that you feel a need to do whatever that abuser is asking you to do so that your kids can get an education. There are other things like forcing the children to perform different acts or chores, things like that, that obviously are not okay to ask children to do. Things that really can impact them developmentally long term. Oftentimes, one of the signs when we go into schools that we talk with teachers and administrators about is all of a sudden homeschooling your children. The mandate to have more supervision over homeschooling, a lot of that has come from domestic violence. That's something that a lot of domestic violence centers are still advocating for, because we see a lot of domestic violence and child abuse happening when all of a sudden the kid is pulled out of school and they're homeschooling. And a lot of times they're not even getting the schooling that they need. And even if they're getting that education piece, they're at home with their abuser all day. So more abuse is happening. So developmentally, it can be really detrimental to these kids. And so that's one of the things that we kind of look out for and that we're aware of and that we want all of you to be aware of. Abuse participants, this can be a really hard pill to swallow, but it is something that happens. We can actually see exact examples in our shelter and in our outreach services where the abuser actually involved the child in the abuse itself. So that can be having the child involved in physically abusing the partner, verbally abusing, and again, it kind of can fall under the two groups of sometimes the kids don't want to, and it's really sad, and it can be a whole lot of trauma that's tied to that event that we need to deal with them. And sometimes it can be the anger side. Sometimes we have children come in who really hate the surviving parent, who really will call them names, will still be mean to them, even in our shelter when they're separated from the abuser, because they've been taught that that's okay and that that's their job, to talk down to mom, to disrespect mom, to hit mom, to not listen to mom or dad. And it can be really, really intense for that surviving parent, as I'm sure all of you can imagine. And that's where empathy can really come in. And that's where you'll see later on our child services can really come in, through the counseling, through the safety planning, the psychoeducation, really teaching them what abuse is, what's okay and what's not okay. But this is something that unfortunately does happen more often than not. So it's also something to be aware of, especially when we're out in public and we see disrespectful kids or we see someone throwing a temper tantrum. And sometimes it could just be mom having a long day and the kid having a temper tantrum. And sometimes we can be really quick to judge that parent of, get your kid under control, or, you know, they hand them a candy bar. Why are you rewarding that negative behavior? And so this is one of those things where we can kind of plug it in our head. Not every situation is an abuse or a domestic violence situation, but it could be. And that potential is enough, or it should be enough, for us to kind of change the way we think and approach situations with a non-judgmental approach. Because if that is a domestic violence survivor and their child is acting out based on them mirroring the abuser's behavior, we should be confronting that situation much, much differently than passing judgmental looks or just misunderstanding a situation completely. And then being abuse victims and survivors themselves. As the children, of course, we listed some of the tactics, but this can also be being previous abuse survivors. Sometimes the abusive partner is not always that child's actual parent. It could be a step parent. It could be a boyfriend or girlfriend of the parent. So sometimes it could be that, well, mom used to be really abusive to me, and now dad's dating someone new, and this person's being abusive to him. And that can add a whole nother layer of trauma and things. We see this especially with adolescents or teens when we get into middle school and high school child survivors of domestic violence. We can see that childhood abuse and past abuse when they were really young are actually impacting them now in this current domestic violence situation. The same thing can be seen when the parent gets out of the domestic violence situation. You know, we've had people return as teenagers who were in a domestic violence situation when they were in elementary school. And now that they're teenagers, their surviving parent could be in a really healthy, safe relationship, and this teen could be very healthy and safe, but they have a lot of emotional and mental turmoil going on about the abuse that happened when they were young. We see that all the time, so the impacts are very lasting, and that's something that we just need to be aware of as advocates, and as people working with children, as people advocating for children, explaining that the emotional and verbal and all those type of impacts really last a lot longer normally than those physical impacts, because physical healing oftentimes will progress further than the emotional healing does in these types of situations. So now that welcome back, everyone. I kind of just wanted to give everyone's brains a breather. So now we're kind of going to go into what Serene Harbor actually provides for these child survivors specifically. And kind of go in depth to see how that helps them and why we do what we do. So the first is individual counseling, and this service, but also all of the services, are provided to survivors and their children, whether they are in shelter or not. So if they come in shelter, they are eligible for all of these services. If they are outreach, they are available for all of the same services. They just don't live here. That is literally the only difference. And that's something we really want to highlight, because not all centers operate that way, and not everybody in the community knows that about us. So I just want to make it clear that we are able to help even if you do not need housing at all. So when it comes to individual counseling with the kids, this is something that we start immediately when they get in. All of our children, when they arrive in shelter or as an outreach referral, are reached out to, and they actually are able to finish their intake packet with me within 72 hours of them either being here or a referral. The 72 hour is something that is actually mandated since we are a certified center, but it is often reached much, much sooner. When it comes to outreach, it often is same day or within 24 hours. The 72-hour window actually just helps us kind of give them space, especially for shelter. Sometimes they're coming in the middle of the night, very early in the morning. Sometimes they're relocating from a different area. Some of our survivors don't speak English. So for the survivor, but especially for the children, it can be really traumatic, frightening, confusing. So we really want to make sure when they come in, we're not jumping them to come talk to a stranger that they don't know. We want to give them time to get comfortable, make it feel like home, and then resume the individual counseling sessions. I meet with all of the children every week. Sometimes this is for full-on counseling sessions. Sometimes it's just a check-in. It just depends what that child and the parent are comfortable with. And of course, for all of these services, the very first thing we do is sign a consent form with mom or whatever parent or parents are bringing the child so that they're eligible for all of this. So the parent is involved the entire way. Group counseling is something for all of you to take note of. Actually, it's open for the public. So we have our outreach and shelter kids. It's every Wednesday evening from 6 to 7. We have our group counseling for kids. At that same time, we actually have another advocate running the adult group, the women's group. So we have a women's support group and a kids group going at the same time. For shelter kids, we actually have it in person, but for all of our outreach and public kids that want to come, we have a virtual link, and I'll email any like handouts or crafts or activities that we're doing ahead of time so that they're able to be just as involved as the children that are here in person. This is oftentimes for the women, it's a support group. For the kids, sometimes it becomes a support group. Sometimes it's more of a psychoeducation group. We focus a lot on what healthy relationships are, what healthy friendships are. Our group this past week, we actually did an entire safety planning group. So we talked about when you're home alone, when someone knocks on the door, things like that. Every week is a different theme. And we actually take parent input of like, hey, could you talk to the kids about this? And we'll work that in or plan an entire group around it. And it almost always has, well, it always has an activity. Sometimes, a lot of times that's art, some kind of like drawing or painting, something. But our group sessions are really, really helpful for the kids. Not only are they able to make friends a lot of times, but it's something that they look forward to. It's something that they have a lot of fun with, and it's something that they're looking forward to that's also teaching them about domestic violence, about abuse, about things without being so direct. Family counseling is something that I use a lot with parents, especially. Sometimes they want siblings brought in, but a lot of times it's, okay, I'm on my 5th session with Sally Jane. Mom, why don't you come in this one and we'll talk about, you know, your dynamic and different things like that. So that's available upon request, or if we just feel, if the adult case manager feels like it would be helpful, or I do, or another advocate, we kind of work together with the parents on that. A behavior health and safety assessment. This again is done with every single child that comes through outreach or in shelter. And this is something that we do with the parent. And just for clarification, the child is anywhere from newborn to 17 is the age that I'm working with. Yes, I said newborn. So even when infants come in, we do a behavior health and safety assessment because that goes into medical history. It goes into behavior assessments, which for babies, it can be developmental. You know, are they walking? Are they talking? Are they doing things? Because we have huge binder like this big of community resources full of referrals that we have direct partnerships with so that we can go, okay, mom, we're seeing these issues. Here's a referral that can really help you with that. And that goes all the way down to the infants, like I said. So the behavior health and safety also goes into, aside from the medical portion and the behavioral portion, it goes into school behavior and school status, as well as safety tied to the abuse. So that's our chance to talk to mom or dad about how the abuse has impacted the child. Have they been direct witnesses? What does that look like? So that we go into the child intake kind of with a background of what's going on. This can look very different between children, younger and older. So I typically tend to be more collaborative when it comes to teens or older kids in this process and kind of explain to them what's going on with the parent. Whereas when it comes to the younger children, I typically just kind of give them an overview of, I just need to talk to mom, you know, about some stuff really quick, and, you know, we'll be right back type of thing. Whereas we see with the teen survivors, a lot of times with that power and control and those abuse tactics they've been exposed to, it really does help them if I explain to them, I'm going to do a behavior health and safety assessment with your mom or dad. This is what that looks like. Feel free to ask them questions or me questions. But I do make sure to do that separate from the child. Safety planning, we talked about. With teens, this can be an individual safety plan and then also a teen dating safety plan. If they talk about if they are dating, if they're in a relationship, if they're interested in dating, if they have a crush, things like that. It tends to be middle school and up if that comes up. And that goes into what a healthy dating relationship looks like. What's okay, what's not okay, do you feel safe, different things like that. With the younger children, I have a youth safety plan and a coloring safety plan. So that kind of helps, again, meet them where they are. For example, my coloring safety plan actually has color in the places where you feel safe. And there's a picture of a house, a school, a bathroom, things like that. So not only does it give me great insight of where they feel safe and where they don't, because then it's my job to explore why don't they feel safe here. And so it kind of helps me meet them, but also it does teach them, we talk about how to call 911. Do you know how to call 911? Do you know the surviving parent's cell phone number? Things like that. And that's something that we do through individual sessions constantly. We update it pretty much weekly with the kids, depending on what's going on. If they switch schools, if mom gets a new job, if dad switches something, then obviously we update that safety plan because it's very important to us that even the young kids in preschool understand how to call 911, where mom is while you're at school, what to do if somebody shows up, things like that. Safety assessments. Sometimes this is physical safety, sometimes it's mental safety, but we do these assessments with the child, again, within that 72-hour window as soon as they come in. Parent advocacy, I actually have individual parenting sessions also with parents weekly, and that's outreach and in shelter. And some of those I'm working directly with their children in sessions and in groups. Sometimes I'm not. Sometimes just the parent needs help, and that's totally okay too. And we talk about different parenting tactics that don't involve physical discipline, or, you know, my kid's just really not listening to me, I don't know what to do. You know, we can schedule a time to sit down and let's talk about it. And different tools and skills that I can give them to help de-escalate situations, things like that. And we also have groups available for that as well. School advocacy actually involves us going directly into the school. It does happen, it has happened. Sometimes that's with teens in high school. There actually, previously this year, were 2 separate cases where it was a teen dating violence situation. And we do trainings in schools, but of course, they're not certified domestic violence centers, and they have, you know, hundreds of thousands of kids that they're looking after and 1,000 things going on. So a lot of times, you know, advocacy for kids when it comes to teen dating violence or domestic abuse can fall through the cracks. So it's our job to go in and explain it to them. So in our 2 previous cases this year, we're involved actually going into the physical school. We actually accompanied the teen and their parents and met with guidance counselors and principals of different schools and presented their safety plan and actually advocated for them we got their class schedule changed. We were able to get a security guard to walk them to classes. And of course, that's not the perfect situation for everybody. Sometimes I can create more embarrassment or more attention. That's not what they want, but for this teen, that's what they requested, and we made sure that we got it done. So sometimes it does involve going into actual schools or going into the athletic department, talking to coaches, going into after school clubs or local community clubs, and actually advocating for that teen or young child and explaining this is what's going on at home. And sometimes that's with the parent, sometimes that's just with the kid. And it's really advocating for these are the services, these are what we've seen, and this is what we think that they need. How could we partner to get that done? So that's one of our really big services that really impacts the kids, because as all of us on this webinar know, kids need advocacy and they need people to step up and be there for them. And we really try to be that voice as much as we can. And that, of course, ties into the community advocacy as well with all of our trainings. School enrollment and daycare enrollment. This is something that we do deal with because people coming into our shelter, again, are sometimes relocating. Sometimes they don't speak any English at all. Sometimes they don't speak Spanish. Sometimes it's German or French or other languages. And they need a lot of help. And sometimes with the power and control, the surviving parent wasn't the one who handled school. They didn't get to pick where their kids got to go to school. They didn't take their kids to school. Their partner controlled everything. So they're now being thrown into an environment where they're in charge of getting to school. They're in charge of finding rides. They're in charge of opening a bank account. They're in charge of all these things. And it can be very, very overwhelming for that parent. So we want to make sure that, one, we come alongside the parent and support them, but two, that in doing that, we're not letting that child fall through the cracks. And so that's where school enrollment and daycare enrollment really comes into play. We actually are partners with Early Learning Coalition and a couple other different community partners and agencies that are able to kind of help in this aspect. We also are able to provide transportation to meetings and everything. Actually, just 2 weeks ago or so, I had 3 different schools and daycares that I went to and brought the kids and mom and completely enrolled all of them in school. And when they're relocating from a different state or county, that can be really complicated. So we really make sure that we here at Serene Harbor are experts on this, that if you come in, you say, I need my kid in school tomorrow, that we'll get it done, that we can handle all the paperwork and help you alongside everything so that those kids aren't missing out on school or socializing or anything. Medical, dental, vision, and physical health. These are all things that we assess for in our assessments that we discussed earlier, and all things that we have direct referrals for and provide transportation for. And that's, again, for outreach as well. We're able to provide all of those referrals to all of our locations and help, as well as mental and developmental health. Sometimes this is with older kids, but typically we see this the most with the younger kids. That can be infants or just lower elementary. If we see that there are some developmental or mental things in counseling that we think could use some further attention, we actually have direct referrals to partners who are able to help. And when I say all these referrals and partners, they typically are at no cost or very, very low cost. So it's something that we are able to help them do all the paperwork and everything so that it's not burdening them financially, because many of them are coming in with little to no money and oftentimes no jobs. So we want to make sure that all of these things are being provided for that child, financial status or not. Transportation, again, is something that we are able to provide on a case-by-case basis. We want to make sure that we're able to get everybody everywhere, of course, and we do our best to really empower our survivors as well and put them in positions to succeed where they're able to get jobs. We help them find jobs. We help them, of course, enroll in school and do all those things so they have time to go do things. And we really try to help them get their own transportation before they leave here is also the goal. Psychoeducation, this of course is used with adults, but specifically with kids, it has to do a lot with terms, where I would talk to adults about domestic violence or teenagers about teen dating violence. With younger children or adolescents, I typically talk about what is a boundary, what is communication, what is the definition of friendship. And by teaching them all of these different concepts, we're actually able to prevent domestic abuse from happening or teen dating violence in the future. We don't want them to grow up to be abusers, and we don't want them to grow up to be survivors either. We want them to grow up being in healthy relationships, and those core components of healthy relationships is really what we like to focus on with the psychoeducation. We're also able to provide clothing, toiletries, and other physical needs like shoes and things like that. That's something, again, that we are able to offer outreach and in shelter, which is why we also take donations for those different things. If you guys actually follow us on Facebook at Serene Harbor, when we have a specific need, it often comes from me. I often have to text or email our marketing rep because we'll have a kid come in and maybe I don't have their exact size shirt or exact size shoes. And we immediately put it on Facebook, hey, we need this size. And our community has been so supportive. They often come through within the next day of stuff that we need. So if you guys are ever interested in donating things or just kind of checking us out, feel free to check us out on Facebook and Instagram there, because mostly that's where we post the child survivor things that we need. Gifts and donations. These are things that we provide for all the children as well. So when they come in, they get a welcome bag. The adults do as well. But we really like to make the children's one have their own and have it be kitty. So, you know, if we had like Spider-Man, we'll put a Spider-Man toothbrush and toothpaste in there and different things like that. little notebooks or coloring books, things that they'll really appreciate. And then the same when they leave, they'll get a to-go bag essentially. But while they're here with us, or if we have outreach clients as well, if we hear there's a birthday coming up, we actually recently had a kindergarten graduation, things like that, we actually provide gifts. And sometimes that can be given from us. Sometimes it's given to the surviving parent. And we just say, it's from you. That's, it's totally from you. So it just depends on the situation, but that's something that we are blessed to say we're able to do as well through donations and different things. But that's a huge thing that a lot of the child survivors that we work with, it really, really means a lot to them. And then a teen dating violence assessment, which I talked about briefly, but just goes into the different dynamics of healthy relationships. And that can kind of change depending on whether or not that teen divulges they're in a relationship. Oftentimes, if that teen is in an abusive relationship or they're not allowed to be dating, they will not tell you if they're dating. So based on age and different things that have come up in the sessions and what, mom or dad says, we'll do that teen dating violence assessment, even if they say they're not dating someone, and just mark it as, well, when you do, this could be really, really helpful. And of course, that's with older, like 16, 17 age children. So this kind of answers the why of why we do all that. Why does any of this even matter? So these are some of the positive impacts of the services that we provide that are measurable. These outcomes are measured and things that we track in our database. But physical health is something that can definitely improve, not only just being removed from the abuse or the abusive situation, because especially if that child was a victim of physical child abuse or even verbal and emotional, their physical health will improve when they're out of that environment, but that's not enough. So having those extra counseling, the support, the safety planning, even something like a birthday gift, and we've had kids come in, they've never had a birthday gift because they've always been in trouble on their birthday, things like that can really help even their physical health, because you see the next one is mental and emotional health ties into physical health so much. It really does. And we've had kids with physical sickness symptoms that have been very, very tied to mental and emotional health. And we addressed those mental and emotional things, their physical health actually improved. School performance is something that we see a lot improving. And something important to note here is sometimes school performance can be a warning sign. For example, if a child starts to really struggle in school when they did not before, that can be a huge warning sign of child abuse and or domestic violence being in the home, but also the opposite. We actually have had children and teens before who have previously not done so well in school. And when abuse began, they all of a sudden started doing incredible. In this specific case, they were actually the kid that no one was worried about. This large family, and the children were all reacting to the abuse in different ways, but this one was excelling. So that child almost got forgotten about because it was, well, John's doing great, so it's okay. And that's something that we also try to be aware of as advocates, because any drastic change like that, even if it's a positive change, can still be a sign. And we want to make sure that just because that child is doing everything they can to be absolutely perfect in school so they don't get home and get in trouble, we don't want to neglect that as an impact of abuse. Family functioning is something that we see a lot, especially when we have multiple people in the family utilizing our services. When the child is meeting with me, when mom is meeting with our adult case manager, when mom is also in our She Mentors program, which is actually our program where female survivors, well, actually female and male survivors, adult survivors of any gender, are able to actually go to college for free at absolutely no cost to them and get a full degree. So that's one of, we have a local college partnering with us on. And so when we have everybody in the family doing different things with different people, that's where we see the whole family functioning improving, which obviously we all know is going to ultimately improve the mental, emotional, physical, really just the whole well-being of that child. Parenting is often improved, which means the child's behavior is often improved. Of course, children are children, so sometimes they're going to throw temper tantrums and they're going to disobey and things like that. But we are trained to be able to recognize the difference between a child disobeying and abuse lingering. And so being able to help the parent kind of understand that, help the child build life skills, like we talked with the boundaries, the communication, knowing what healthy relationships are. Socialization, we have a lot of withdrawn children that we work with based on the abuse and domestic violence. So getting them re-socialized with other children that have gone through similar situations, getting them enrolled in schools and daycares where they feel comfortable, things like that. Building healthy relationships now. So it not only helps them to have healthy relationships in the future when they do start dating or get married or things of that nature, it also helps them build healthy relationships now. So it helps that 5-year-old understand that it's not okay to hit their friends, or it's not okay for their friends to hit them, for example. Or it helps that 15-year-old know that it's not okay to disrespect their teacher because that teacher is a person too. Things like that. We really try to use examples in our trainings that are pertinent to the population we're working with. And prevention. That is our #1 goal, because like I said earlier, violence is 100% preventable, and that starts with our youth. So by doing all of these different child services, we're not only preventing future abuse or abusers, but also future survivors, because we're teaching them these skills now. And so that's why our prevention ties so much into youth, because the youth in our community are our future, at risk of sounding cliche. So it's important to meet them where they are. So we're going to go into some of the impacts really quick. So here are some of the physical impacts. We've talked about a lot of this, so I'll kind of run through, but these are just some of the warning signs for us to be aware of. Obviously physical injuries, but also trouble sleeping. Wetting the bed can be a physical manifestation of stress, or tummy aches, headaches. Aggression in teens or adolescents, we're seeing unplanned pregnancies and substance abuse. And shockingly enough, the substance abuse especially can even be seen in younger children, elementary aged, unfortunately. And it's actually proven for long-term health risks, actually, and this is domestic violence in the home, can actually cause diabetes, obesity, cancer, heart disease, and tobacco use are all statistically higher. Mental and emotional impacts, increased negative emotions, severe separation anxiety. And that separation anxiety can be from the surviving parent or connected to the abusive parent. Fear that often doesn't make sense. So when you see a child that is so fearful of something, and you'll just be like, that's odd. If you just get that little, there's something off feeling, listen to that. Decision making, we often see this in adolescents and teens. Risky decision making is something that we see a lot. Low self-esteem and low self-worth. Conflict resolution skills are often very low, so that's something that we have to work on with both the children and the adults. And then again, long-term health risks mentally, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and abusive relationships are all statistically higher with child survivors of domestic violence. Social impacts, this can be the view on relationships, which can be a couple different views. It could be, I never want to get married, or I never want to date if this is what love is. Or it could be, it's okay for me to hit somebody, or it's okay for me to be mean to somebody because mom and dad do it. Or just that it's okay to be disrespectful to teachers or to friends, things like that. So kind of reworking those views is something that we work really hard on with the children, especially. Again, being withdrawn, conditional positive emotions. So I'll be nice to you if you do this. As soon as you hear kids playing like that, that can be a sign, because that's something that they're growing up with in their house, is dad or mom, I'll be nice to you if you do this type of thing. So that's something that can be mirrored a lot. Privacy issues, limited socialization, and then learning disabilities and placement are often more prevalent. And we've actually had children come in with severe learning disabilities and actually special placements in schools. And as we began to work with them, and other shelters have worked with them, their learning disabilities that everybody thought actually disappeared. And so we realized it actually wasn't a learning disability. It was actually that child abuse and the domestic violence in the house impacting them. So just something to be aware of. And then teen dating violence. So just some stats on specifically teens. Nearly 1 in 3 teens that have been in a dating relationship experienced abuse of some kind. That's 1/3 of every teen that you know. And that's only the reported ones. So that is huge. It's happening all around us. Only 33% of teens who have been in an abusive relationship have told anyone about it. Girls and young women between the ages of 16 and 24 are at the highest rates for IPV. So that's an important range to kind of know. Teens are 3 times more likely to endure digital abuse. And that study was before COVID. I would suspect it actually would be higher during COVID. And 81% of parents don't believe teen dating violence is an issue, which is mostly because they don't know about it, which is why we take our education portion really seriously. Here are the methods of abuse, which we talked about earlier, but just to show you that these are actually all prevalent in teen dating violence as well. The verbal, the mental and emotional, the physical, the sexual, and the digital. The only one we have out here is financial. That can play into teen dating violence, but it typically is more seen in domestic violence. So how teens react. This is important because when you're working with teens, which all of these signs and stats and everything are from age 13 up, which a lot of us count as adolescents. So it really is pretty young people. And it's important to know that they react much differently than adults. They often maintain contact and or relationship as if nothing happened. So whereas we see domestic violence wanting to leave and feeling like they can't, we see teens convincing themselves that nothing happened and they're super happy in their relationship. So just something to be aware of. And then some of the signs we talked about earlier, but some more that we added here were self-harm and suicidal ideation. We've seen that a lot with teens and even younger adolescent children tied directly to domestic violence in the home. And then our last portion is community prevention. These are a few of our trainings, and the next slide has more, but I actually want to put the 4 that we take into schools and other child age centers. So I recently did a training with the South Brevard debutantes. We go into like YMCA type places, rec centers, churches, really anywhere where there's a children's program, we can do these. But typically we see that being done in schools. So second step is our elementary aged training and prevention, which is a social and emotional learning program. There's 22 lessons that we can kind of customize based on what that principal, teacher, parent, whoever is making that decision decides that they want. There's 4 modules. There's skills for learning, empathy, emotion management, and problem solving. This is really where we kind of show our belief that prevention starts early. So second step is our elementary program. Our SEL program is our middle school program. And it really takes our second step program to the next level. So it starts tying in the deeper relationships, friendships start to become more important. You start to begin building crushes, dating might start. So we really want to cater to that 6th through 8th grade developmental level and where they are at. This has 8 modules, which is what is violence, defining healthy relationships, media and relationships. There's a lot that we do there as well. In her shoes and in their shoes are kind of one and the same, so I'll kind of just explain it as a whole. In her shoes is a community education tool that we use for high school students and adults. In their shoes is the same as in her shoes, but from a teenage point of view. Teen dating violence. So some high schools like us having the adult version, the in her shoes. The last time we did it, we actually did it with 4 groups of 150 students, about an hour-and-a-half session each, and we just cycled them through a huge gymnasium. This was obviously pre-COVID, right before COVID actually. But it's essentially a simulation actually. So we do it with teachers, faculty, church staff, businesses, groups, people like you all who are interested in learning more. And it's actually a 1 or 2 hour session essentially, and it provides perspective. So it's literally a simulation where you are put in the shoes of a domestic violence survivor, and you have cards where you are given a scenario and you have to decide. For example, abuse happens, it'll explain it, and you decide, do I want to report to law enforcement or do I want to go back home? And you choose, and depending on what you choose, the journey changes. And so typically we haven't done it since COVID, but pre-COVID, we do it in a very large area. There's tables set up with props, and you actually have to walk across the gymnasium or like a big auditorium, depending on what decision you make. It's very interactive and really, really eye-opening. So that's their in their shoes and in her shoes training. So meeting your training needs, I just wanted to list out some of the other trainings that we do. I'll just highlight a couple because I know we're wrapping up. But the Cut It Out, for example, is actually something where we actually go into salons, hair salons, nail salons, barbers, and we actually train the staff on signs of domestic violence in the home and child abuse, because oftentimes that is the only place that abusers allow their partner to go, and oftentimes they take the children with them. So we train them on warning signs. Workplace trainings, we actually go into workplaces and train them on how to handle if an employee reports that they are having domestic violence situation or child abuse situation, as well as warning signs, etc. And then all the topics you see here, as well as many, many more that we offer in community groups, etc., places like this. And the Serene Harbor Crew, this is actually our youth spinoff. So if you guys want to check us out at Serene Harbor Crew Facebook, it's also on our website, but this is our youth-oriented page. We typically see adolescents, pretty much like 6th through 12th grade, typically active, because that's who, has the phones and social media. So it's less towards the younger kids, but we do get a lot of interaction on this from youth in our community. So if you guys want to check that out, please feel free. This is our flyer, this page and the next page. So I won't go through it. It pretty much goes over a lot of what we talked about, but it has a lot of our services on it, and you guys have it as a handout as well. So please feel free to look through and let me know if you have any questions. I believe the next slide has contact information after that one, maybe. Yes. Okay, so there's my contact information. My name is Georgia. Allison is my amazing coworker and the domestic violence child welfare advocate. Please feel free to reach out to either of us. My email and our phone numbers are there. You can text or email with any further questions, or if you want some handouts from really anything I talked about or any resources or questions, please feel free to reach out. And I think we might have had some questions. Maybe?
Yes, Georgia, thank you. We do have some questions. This is a two-part question. How many clients, adults and children, are you typically working with at any time? Of those, how many are outreach and how many are in shelter?
Okay, that's a great question. So our shelter right now has like a COVID capacity where we're only allowed to have a certain number of people. So that kind of fluctuates depending on how many families have kids. Typically, I would say that most of my clients are either in shelter or previous shelter residents. So a lot of my outreach are people that were in shelter either recently and left and wanted to continue services, or I was there a year or 2 years or 5 years ago and I would like to start services again. So I would say that most of them are connected to shelter in some way. However, I am really trying to build up the outreach portion. Our adult case manager works with a lot of outreach, so his numbers actually might look a little bit different. But for me, it's definitely mostly shelter or previous shelter.
And approximately how many participants does Serene Harbor serve on a yearly basis?
So that's a tough one. On a yearly basis, from everybody, thousands based on all of our services. And the thing to remember is all of us have a different focus. So that's what's great, is our numbers are massive. And again, our actual male survivor numbers are really rising there as well. But all of our services, when I say those thousands per year, are not only me working with the children, our adult case manager, but that's also our child welfare advocate who works with DCF, our IFP attorneys, our administration, all of the different services that we provide. But yes, quite a lot.
And how long do clients stay in your shelter, and what is a typical transition program or process?
That's a great question. So the typical stay for us is about 45 days. That can be way less or way more. We've had people here for much longer and much shorter, but the average we've seen is about 45 days. And the transition process is It really starts from the first day they come in with the assessments of their needs. We figure out, what do you need from us to be able to, for lack of a better term, live your best life. That's the quote that I like to use, especially with the kids. So if that's I don't have transportation, I don't have a job, I don't have a house, then we actually go to all of our different programs and we get them transportation and those in a house. That's what we do. So it's very unique to each person, but typically that transition process starts from the first day they get here with that assessment. From there, it's actually getting them connected. So if they have children, it's getting them connected with me. If they need an injunction for protection, it's getting them connected with our attorney. If they need a job, it's getting them connected with our adult case manager. If they need a house, it's getting them connected with our relocation advocate. So we have people really designated very well for each individual area. So once we see what their needs are, we refer them to that contact, and we are able to get them relocated, get them cars, get them jobs, get them free educations, all of that. So it really starts from there. But we typically see about 45 days is pretty average and honestly pretty common. It's not normally much less than that or much more than that, but we've had cases where people are here about a year before, so it just really depends.
Thank you. Another question is, what makes Serene Harbor different from any other DV program or facility?
Another great question. I love this. So quite a few things make us a little bit different. The services that we offer is one. Not all domestic violence shelters provide the same services. For example, our attorney, not all domestic violence shelters have an attorney on site that is specifically just for IFPs. Same with our child welfare advocate or me as a child counselor. There are different roles that not every shelter has all of them, and we essentially have nearly all of them designated to specific people that are trained in what they're doing. Another thing that people tend to highlight as us being different is our kennel. We actually have an on-site kennel where we're able to house pets, because a big issue with domestic violence shelters is that they're not often able to take animals. And that can be really tough because we have survivors who will not leave without their pets. I mean, we all know how much we love our pets. And we have children who, I mean, can form all kinds of depression and anxiety and all kinds of things away from their pet. And they're giving up so much. Sometimes they leave in the middle of the night without any clothes or shoes or toys or anything. So we don't want to make them leave their family dog. So we actually have an on-site pet kennel where pets are welcome. And we also have an outdoor dog park on our facilities right next to the our full ground playground that we have. So that's another thing that makes us different. The last thing I'll highlight is that we're certified. Not all domestic violence shelters are certified, and certified is tied into the training that we're required to do. The CE credits we're required to get as all of us employees, not only us as case managers, but also our advocates who just cover the hotline. And we're 24/7, so advocates that come at night, they're all required to do CE credits and have that 30 hours of training. And certified also means that we're completely confidential. So when someone calls, we are legally bound to their confidentiality. There are other centers and shelters that are not legally certified, which means if they get called to court, they have to divulge information. If we got called to court, we're bound by confidentiality. So we're not gonna give any information or say anything that's going to cause more harm to that survivor.
That's great information to know. We have some volunteers asking if they suspect someone is a victim of domestic violence, what do you recommend they do?
So the first thing that I would do is if you are able to provide them with our number, that would be great. I, of course, now have business cards that I'm able to hand out, but you could even just write our number on little slips of paper. And I actually used to do this with a previous shelter in my old location. And I would just hand them out because they're discreet and you can put them in your phone case or in your wallet, things like that. But referring them to us or another shelter in their area would be the first thing that I would do, because then they're able to call, again, a confidential place that can really either help them or refer them to someone that can help them. Unfortunately, domestic abuse is not a mandated report. So if you actually see somebody being a victim of domestic violence, you're not able to be legally protected if you call and report them. That being said, if you see a child involved, then I would call. You can call 911 even, or you can call DCF, but you can 911. You can call if you either see a child being involved in that, or even if you overhear a child, like if we overhear a child being involved or child abuse over the phone, we will report that. So if there's a child, it's 100% reportable. If you just see domestic violence or you have some suspects, you can either give them our number or a hotline number, or even just give them some of the information that you know. Either give them information that you have, that there is help out there, or even a sentence of encouragement. We actually have people in shelter who have said, you know, like, we'll be like, what made you, you know, want help? And they'll say somebody in the grocery store just recognized what I was going through, and they said, you can do this, go get help, like you can do it. And they got help and they never went back. So, and we hear little stories like that all the time. So honestly, these men and women and children, they are going through things where nobody is in their corner. Nobody has their back. So even tiny minimal encouragers like that, if you get 10 seconds to pull them away from their abuser or something, little sentences like that can make all the difference.
If you're asking for donations on Facebook and some of our volunteers, our guardians, get these items, should they mail them, or how should they get them to the shelter?
So you can, since we're a confidential location, we don't have a street address. However, if you have donations that you want to drop off, or if you're interested in volunteering or getting involved or something, you can actually call the hotline and explain that you have donations to drop off or whatever the case may be. And whoever the advocate is on the hotline, which is that number on the screen right there, they'll actually be able to give you verbal directions, because we literally do not have a street address to give out, to come here. And you'll go to actually our outreach office building, so not our shelter house where I am, but you'll go to the outreach building, and we actually will have an employee come out and meet you. And you'll actually have to sign a non-disclosure paper since you are at our office location. But you can drop them off there, and they will take care of them for you. And another thing for volunteering, if you guys are interested or in our events, if you go to our website, we have a couple different events coming up, and we always need volunteers. So if you're ever looking for you, or if your children need community service hours or things like that, we also have those forms to sign. So that's just another little plug that made me think of that.
All right. Well, thank you, Georgia. This was very informative. Unfortunately, it's a topic that way too many children have been impacted by, and it's based on the stats that you shared, it's just another type of pandemic that our society is going through. Mm-hmm. And it's great that Serene Harbor has all of these services and programs to, you know, help the kids who have gone through all this trauma and the survivors as well. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I appreciate all of you listening, or anybody watching the recording later. Please feel free to email me, or that number you can call or text as well, to reach out if you have any more questions or think of anything. But thank you for your time and attention. And I really hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. You as well, Georgia. This was excellent.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day.